Hi, this is Zibby Owens, and you're listening to Totally Booked with Zibby, formerly Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. In my daily show, I interview today's latest best-selling, buzziest, or underrated authors and story creators whose work I think is worth your time. As a bookstore owner, publisher, author, and obviously podcaster, I get a comprehensive look at everything that's coming out and spend my time curating the best books so you don't have to. Stay in the know, get insider insights, and connect with guests like I do every single day. For more information, go to zibbymedia.com and follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens. Wendy I. Zierler is the author of Going Out with Knots, My Two Kaddish Years with Hebrew Poetry. Wendy is the Sigmund Falk Professor of Modern Jewish Literature and Feminist Studies at HUC-JIR in New York. Prior to joining HUC-JIR, she was a research fellow in the English department of the University of Hong Kong. She received her PhD and her MA from Princeton University and her BA from Stern College of Yeshiva University and an MFA in fiction writing from Sarah Lawrence College. In June 2021, she received rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva Maharat. Her most recent book is Going Out with Knots, My Two Kaddish/COVID Years with Hebrew Poetry. She is also the author of Movies and Midrash, Popular Film and Jewish Religious Conversation, and of Rachel Stole the Idols, The Emergence of Hebrew Women's Writing, and many articles in the field of Jewish literature and Jewish gender studies. She is married to Daniel Feit and has 3 adult children. Welcome, Rabbi. Thank you so much for coming on Totally Booked to talk about your book, Going Out with Knots. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here.
I just wanted to start by reading this little snippet from your introduction, and then I want you to talk about the whole project and everything else, if that's okay. But in the intro, you were talking about praying. You set the stage, and then you wrote, in writing this book, I too was praying. I too was giving vent to my hopes and yearnings and seeking meaning in the aftermath of unremitting personal loss. First, the sudden shocking death of my father, and then within less than a year, the loss of my mother. It was a dogged, sometimes paradoxical effort as a professor of Hebrew literature at a Reform rabbinical seminary, as a woman devoted to living in a modern Orthodox community, and later, as a newly ordained Orthodox rabbi, to find my place in the male-centered liturgy and prayer rituals that Jewish tradition has prescribed for such a loss. I had to wrestle with challenges to faith and hope arising in the wake of successive bereavements and a liturgy that often did not seem to speak in my voice. And I had to come to terms simultaneously with a worldwide pandemic isolating us all. And then you say, I did find healing, solace, and hope through a project I came to call the Shir Hadash Shel Yom. So now let's hear about the whole thing.
Thank you so much, and thanks for choosing that passage. So this book, Going Out with Knots, on the most basic level, is a grief memoir. It was the story of my experiencing these 2 consecutive losses within 1 year. The shocking death of my father. He was meeting a friend, making his way from a car to go into a restaurant and meet a friend, and was struck dead by a distracted truck driver. And so the experience of being hurled into being a mourner. At the time when I was busy writing a story, kind of in collaboration with my father, about his own experience of having to wrangle a prayer quorum, a minyan, to say Kaddish for his own mother who was hit by a car. So it was a crazy recapitulation of circumstances. And from the very beginning, I knew that I was going to be a kind of reluctant or antsy Kaddish reciter. I'm very acquainted with prayer, but I knew that I'd have to be there morning, afternoon, and night, reciting the same things over and over and again. And so I knew from the beginning that I was going to need something else to keep me going. I knew as a feminist, I knew as a literary type, that sort of repetition within that context, I was going to need something. I never thought that I would be doing it for as long as I did, because my mother, whom we very heroically had to pick up from her shock, move her from Toronto, where she was living at the time, to New York, where my siblings and I were living, get her a dialysis slot because she was the sick one. My dad was perfectly healthy when he was killed. Within 5 months of moving her, she ended up dying too, albeit under voluntary terms. That is, she got to a health point where she realized that her life quality would never be restored. And so she chose to terminate her dialysis. And we had these 2 deaths one which was so sudden and alone, and another which was thoughtful and accompanied and quite holy, but that occurred within less than 11 months of one another. And I ended up having to say Kaddish therefore for 22 consecutive months. And this all happened 6 weeks, before the outbreak of COVID, where we were very aware that had my mother died just a few weeks later, we never would have been able to be there next to her. But what that meant, the shutdown for COVID was exactly a year after my father's death on March 12th, 2020. And suddenly the synagogue that I had, kind of grudgingly gone to twice a day was shut down completely. Now, I will say that one of the way that I got to coping with all of this is I took on this discipline that came from my own scholarly background and vocation, which is that every week I would choose a different modern Hebrew poem. I would choose it, translate it, teach it as something that had to do with grief or prayer or of something of relevance, the matters of the day, so that I could bring something new to this experience, the kind of liturgical rote of daily Kaddish recitation. At first, I just would pick the poem and translate it and bring a photocopy to synagogue and kind of make it up what I was going to say during the service. But when the COVID shutdown occurred, no one could come to synagogue anymore. And I suddenly realized that I had already assembled something of a following for this weekly class, that I should write it up for those who couldn't come. And so I started writing these weekly essays, which, as you can imagine, this practice has continued to this day. So I have like 300 plus teachings like this. I wanted to commemorate this experience, both of the mourning and the experience of COVID, and this coping mechanism, this strategy, and shape it into a memoir that could interweave all of these things together.
Wow. Well, I am so sorry for the losses of your parents in close succession like that, and the shock of the loss, just all of it, the stress on you and your family, and just that period of time. And yet grateful that you were able to write through it and now have something that can help others through their journey as well. As you were going through and picking each poem, how did you pick which passage to translate, and what did you learn sort of all in from doing this experiment, or exercise, not experiment, let's say exercise?
So, unlike a kind of professorial approach or an academic approach, which would have been historical, you choose, the earliest poets first and the later poets later. What I was doing is trying to find material that spoke to what I was experiencing. And then increasingly, as we moved into COVID, to what everybody else was experiencing. And part of what I was experiencing was the frustration of being a woman in an Orthodox prayer setting where women are not counted, where women's voices are not represented in the prayer book. And so I initially gravitated to women poets. I had written my first book about the first Hebrew women poets, and I wanted, not so subtly, to have their voices represented liturgically. No woman's voice is represented in the traditional prayer book. And so this would be a way, in a sense, of compiling an alternative Siddur, a prayer book. So I would choose, first I began with the poet Leah Goldberg, a canonical, important modern Hebrew poet. And then I would just read through the whole books and put tape flags on the poems that seemed to speak to me. I began with a poem that was to my mother. It was at the time when I was grieving my father, but living with my mother in a new way, just down the block. And I was finding that her experiences, having lost her father and having this incredibly close relationship with her mother, were dovetailing with mine. And so I was looking for ways to actually read my life through these figures that I admired who could offer me inspiration.
Wow.
And it continued like that. So I'd live with one poet for about 5-6 months and see what I could get. And then when it felt like I had exhausted that well, I would dig another well and move on to a different poet. So, and it moved on to men as well, men with idiosyncratic voices that were expressing doubt and frustration and theological denial, all sorts of things that I think are not properly addressed especially for a mourner, there is no theological account or story that can make sense of accidental, pointless death. It doesn't fit the theological model. And so you feel as if no one is there. I mean, no transcendent one is there. And so the poets, this one poet, Avram Khalfi, who wrote a poem called Heretic's Prayer, that seemed very apt. Or the poet Yehuda Amichai, who has this beautiful image of God as a car mechanic lying underneath the world and forever tinkering and trying to fix the world, but breaking something new each time. And you can only see his feet. That felt very apt for the experience that I was having. And so I wanted my community to experience the greatness of these poets, really excellent poets, and see how valuable their writing could be to expand the canon of what we consider to be classic Jewish texts. It's not just these hardback books with gold lettering on the front and marbleize around the edges, but that modern literature also can be a source of spiritual strength, that it can be holy in this unconventional sense.
Wow. So can you take me back? And I know obviously you write about this in your book and all of that, but just for those who don't know you or your story at all, can you explain, how did you even become a rabbi? Tell me about growing up. What did you want to be then? Your whole background and how you got to here.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so I actually never expected to be a rabbi, though I come from a rabbinic family. My uncle was a rabbi. My brother is a rabbi. I grew up first in a small town in Western Ontario. That's where all my family immigrated from Galicia, from what used to be Austria-Hungary. There was oil there, so they moved to this refinery town in Canada. And my family was the only observant Jewish family, aside from the rabbi in some cases, including the rabbi in this town. And I write about that whole curiosity of my family experience in this book that I just finished, that I had been trying to write while my father was still alive. My family moved to Toronto when I was 5. I'm the youngest of 4. And my father did this unthinkable thing. He gave up a thriving business so that he could stop working on the Sabbath, and so that they could send us to Jewish schools. And so this idea of Jewish commitment runs really deep in my family. You put your livelihood on the line for Judaism. I grew up with that. But I grew up wanting to be first and foremost a writer. And I figured that the best way to become a writer was to study literature, to read and read and read and read. And so I went and did a PhD in comparative literature. And all along, I was doing creative writing as well. And my idea was to try and figure out a way to bring together my worlds, the world of secular literature and Jewishness. And I did that for a number of years. That has always been very gratifying for me. I was able to get a job training rabbinical students using this, I guess, peculiar orientation of mine, which is that modern, even secular literature can be part of the holy canon. That's kind of that these modern works can be an important interpretive layer to our tradition. But then this opportunity presented itself, which never had been there before, while I was already an academic for a few decades, of being able to train to be an Orthodox rabbi. That was just not an opportunity that I could even imagine before. I was approached by the founder of Yeshivat Maharat, which is the first seminary to ordain women in the Orthodox tradition. And they offered to give me a fellowship to join a remarkable cohort of women who were meant to backfill the ranks, people who maybe 20 years ago would have become rabbis, but we just never had an opportunity. And it included a fantastic group, people who are heads of school, another professor of literature. My study partner, Lindsay, lives in England. And in fact, we went through the experience together of her ordination becoming something of a scandal in the UK, where she was no longer invited to teach in the various places where she had previously taught, because she had gotten ordained, because it was considered heretical to become a rabbi.
But then how did you end up writing the book about movies?
Oh, okay, wonderful. Thank you for asking me that. So almost the first few weeks of my getting hired, I had lived in Hong Kong and I got this job. My husband and I moved back from Hong Kong to and New York, on 9/11, in fact, I know that you have your own traumatic experience with 9/11. We moved back to New York just weeks before 9/11, and I was downtown that day. I write about that actually in the introduction to my movies book. On that day, I was supposed to teach on Tuesday of 9/11. I was stuck. The subway spilled me out, like kicked me off, and I didn't know what to do. None of us had. I didn't have a cell phone at the time. No one's phone worked. So I walked down to my office, and I was stuck there for several hours with an older colleague, a man named Eugene Borowitz, who was the leading theologian of liberal Judaism. And during that day, we got to talking, and he pitched to me the idea of teaching a class on theology and movies. I had done some film teaching at the University of Hong Kong. And so we innovated this class that uses film and television as a springboard for religious conversation. And that for 15 years, we taught together. And then I wrote this book, Movies and Midrash, which employs this method where you do a close reading of a film or a TV show, and then you talk about the central religious idea it has and how it can, and what Judaism has to say about that same thing. And that actually is going to be one of my next books, the TV sequel. I have movies and Midrash, and now I'm going to have TV and Torah.
Oh, that's awesome. Is that almost done, or how far into it are you?
What I'm going to include is sketched out, but no, it's very much at the beginning. I've been working on it.
Okay. Oh, well, there's certainly a lot of different, and I can't wait to hear, all these new shows and old shows. Actually, when my husband converted, the rabbi had him just go home and watch a whole bunch of movies. That was like part of his conversion exercise.
That makes good sense.
Yes, which was great. I was like, oh, how fun. I'll do it with you. I can rewatch these movies. My goodness. So I'm speaking in a couple weeks. By the time this comes out, it will be around the high holidays and all of that. But I'm talking to some Reform rabbis about what people want to hear. What do we think congregants want to hear this year from rabbis? Like, what are your thoughts on what you're going to share with your with congregation, with peers and all of that? Like, where do we even go from here? This is such a crazy time.
No, it's very, very difficult. I actually was asked by my synagogue to give a sermon pre-high holidays. And there are many things I want to talk about. And since I'm teaching every single week, they hear a lot from me, and at least during the weekdays. But I've chosen to speak about the centrality in Judaism of concern for the stranger. In my synagogue, which abounds with people with very firm commitments to Israel, stalwart Zionists, against this backdrop of 2 years of relentless war and the hostages still being stuck there, and the most recent bad news that we've been hearing on both sides. It feels important for the community to double down on its core mission. So love of God, God's love of us, and by extension, God's love of the stranger, which is a crazy, weird, unexpected thing that one sees in Deuteronomy 10, where amidst all of this, as part of the covenant, God says, I love you, you love me, and by the way, I love the stranger. And so we have that's our Trinity, I'm going to be arguing.
I just interviewed actually Sarah Hurwitz, who wrote a book called As a Jew, which is coming out soon. And she was also just talking about this love of a stranger, but that it is paired always with how, and I'm going to get this wrong, but you always have to watch your back as well, because there was a story about, a tribe attacking the weakest people in the back. And so we have to have hold both of those truths at once.
Absolutely. And context is everything. So this is a context of people who are praying daily, Psalms for Israel, reciting prayers every single day for the IDF and for the hostages. Aaron, my dog tag, we've all been, I just can't wait to throw it out. But there's a sense of hardening that happens in a protracted war. So reminding that our core mission has to do with an empathetic orientation is something that I think that's important. And it's important, for us, if I bring it back to my book, part of the challenge of my book was figuring out a way to stay connected to tradition, even when things great or, death is the most radical sense of disconnection that a person can ever experience. And it makes you feel detached from the regular run of things. And then if your experience of ritualizing that grieving casts you aside in some way, as women might often feel, it can be a point of disconnection. And is it okay if I explain the title? And it might.
Yes, of course.
Because it's a weird, odd title. And I actually had to fight with my publisher to get them to stick with it because they said no one's going to understand what this means. So just without knowing the background, it's about trying to figure out how you can stay knotted and tied and connected to a tradition under such circumstances, or stay connected with a community when we're all atomized because of COVID. But it came specifically from an experience that I had in the aftermath of my dad's death. There's this ritual in the first 30 days of mourning. There's a custom of studying Mishnah. So that's the first layer of the Talmud. You take the entire Mishnah, which is 6 tractates, and you divide it up among friends and family so that by the 30 days, when the 30 days are over, the whole thing will have been studied. And that comes from this idea that the word Mishnah has the same Hebrew letters as the word neshama, which means soul. And so through this, you're going to elevate the soul. And I had chosen to study tractate Shabbat because I told you my father had given up a business so that he could stop working on the Sabbath. And the day that I was home in Toronto, staying with my mom, it was just a few weeks after his death. And she had just given my father's talit, his prayer shawl, to pray with. She knew that even though that's not typical of Orthodox women, that I did. And at the very first day that I was wearing his prayer shawl, I'm at synagogue in the morning, and the Mishnah that I opened up, because it was like a downtime in the service when I could add in a little learning. It talked about this rule. There's a concern on the Sabbath that you're not allowed to carry things from your private property outside, because hauling things around is a kind of work. And so you have to figure out what is clothing and what is something extra. What are acceptable accessories and what would be considered a load. And so the question is, or the rule is stated that a son can go out with knots. And the question is, what are these knots? What are they talking about? And they resolve that the knots that they're speaking of are if a boy or a son is going out and is going to miss his dad, the father takes a strap from his right shoe and ties it either to the son's left shoe or left arm. And that not being there will be a reminder of the father, and it will quell his longings. He won't miss his dad. So then the question is asked, well, why sons and not daughters? And that morning that I was wearing my father's prayer shawl with its knots for the very first time, I read a commentary that said, well, it doesn't mention daughters because daughters never miss their fathers. And I know about your very close relationship with you.
Yes.
And I was just shocked. I literally screamed out, like, what? How could it be? I was so close with my dad. I was wearing his ritual knots, and someone was telling me that I didn't miss him. And so this whole book became a metaphorical effort to go out with knots, with my dad, with my mom, with my belongingness to the Jewish community, with my belongingness to traditional practice, not in knots, that is NOTS, not in all the things that you aren't allowed to do, or the negativity, how to make this crushing experience of death not be it is a rending. I mean, we ritually there, but that it not be like a forever detachment. And so some of these poets who, like Yud Amichai, grew up observant, religious, and then became secular in his youth, and yet he writes so beautifully about how his experiences from youth linger with him, just in different ways, like they transform, become something different. And he recalls what it was like, he says anyone who wore a talit as a child will remember, and he compares the experience of wrapping in a prayer shawl to going to the beach and getting out of the cold water and wrapping up in a towel and having the feeling of being warm and shivering and laughing and blessing. And so that there are these tools, imaginative tools, especially if you look at something indirectly through the prism of something else, just staring at grief. It's tough. But if you can look at it through a different prism, then you can get a different insight.
Amazing. Well, Rabbi, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your story, for sharing your life and your analysis and all of it. So I appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Appreciate being with you.
Okay. All right. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Totally Booked with Zibby, formerly Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you loved the show, tell a friend, leave a review, follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens, and spread the word. Thanks so much. Oh, and buy the books.